Now for today's topic, assessing the value and role of remote technologies and operations. So, over the past few years, we have witnessed many advances in remote and increasingly autonomous operations, monitoring and supply. And the discussion around the value these bring to the maritime and supply chain industries has increased. Recent events have shown a spotlight even more closely on the potential these developments can offer and how technology is evolving the future of remote shipping and autonomous vessel systems. So with us today, we have an esteemed group of experts covering a broad range of experiences with and knowledge of remote technologies and operations. We have owners and operators, technical managers, service providers, OEMs, and technologists. And a common denominator for a number of the gentlemen joining me on stage is that they also have experience from the classification societies. So I will ask the other panelists to please join us on stage, and I will leave it to each one of you to introduce yourselves and talk briefly about who you are and why you're here and what your experience is in the field of remote technologies and operations. So if I could ask Håkon, Jamie, Tarun, and Dominic to join us on stage, please. We all seated in the order of the screen as well. Excellent. That's almost a first. So I'm gonna start from this side. So I'm gonna start from my immediate left. Claus.
Sure. I mean, I gave you my views on technologies already. I joined Eastern Pacific Shipping as Chief Innovation Officer back in October 2019. Seems like ages ago. And I also run the IT department, which is less sexy, but equally or more important IT infrastructure things we're doing there. And before that, I was a few years in oil and gas. I was in the digital innovation team here in Asia and Singapore for BP. And before that, I was involved with a number of different things. I had a startup in Hong Kong called 3D Avatar School, which back in 2010-11 was creating virtual reality training environments to teach kids in China English. That was good fun, and it was very gamified. And before that, I was involved with a couple of other consultancies, Booz-Allen and Accenture. I think everybody was at Accenture at some point in their life. And with Shazam, the music startup. That's kind of my background.
Excellent, thank you. And Tarun?
First of all, thanks for having me on a physical panel. It does feel great to start off the year in a physical event. So hopefully, for a better 2021. Quick background, I've been in the shipping industry for the last 13 odd years. Started off as a trainee surveyor in 2008 with DNV. What was interesting is we were probably the first cohort of trainee surveyors where DNV at that point had tried out virtual training of surveyors in an augmented simulation way. And obviously I'm made to believe that the training methodologies are now evolving from an AR, VR perspective. Beyond that, I've worked in different parts of the maritime industry in technical commercial roles. Last 1 year or so, I decided to take the leap of faith and jump at the deep end of venture building, and basically with a view to accelerate adoption of technology for the maritime industry, and of course, where maritime actually interjects with the global supply chain. So currently I'm leading the open innovation platform at Rainmaking, where we are looking at basically providing a platform for large incumbents to collaborate in a de-risk fashion with startups around challenges like supply chain resilience, maritime decarbonization, and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Jamie Ramsamy. I'm the head of HSSEQ at Thome Group. Like Tarun, I started off my journey at DNV. I was there for approximately 12 to 13 years, mainly doing offshore new building. So when I made the switch to Thome Group, it was a bit of an interesting one. We looked heavily into new technologies moving forward. And one of the most interesting experiences, not for me personally, was that I was a part of the PS71 Smart Port Challenge in 2019. And it seems that fate does not lack a sense of irony. The problem statement that we gave in 2019 was, how do you provide remote support to vessels? And less than 6 months later, we have now the first signs of the pandemic. So a lot of the learnings that we had during those 6 months led to us developing a whole host of processes and philosophies and methodologies to tackle both remote inspections and remote audits as well. In addition to that, we've been leveraging off all of the increasing amount of data that we've been getting and trying to reimagine the way we look at risk. So we look forward to what we are discussing today. Thank you.
Morning, good day to live audience and those in the virtual background. My name is Dominic. Myself, I've been involved the last 20 years in the space of maritime application. Started with more of the ship management system, and the last couple of years more involved with fuel and energy initiatives for vessels. Currently, I'm part of the Wartsila Voyage team, involved in promoting our smart marine ecosystem, which is basically our initiative to leverage on latest technologies to build a series of data-enabled applications to link asset, voyage, and performance management. My role in this topic, well, like I said, I started my career with shipping application software systems. The role of remote operations was not something new, right? I mean, when we have the ship and shore connectivity, ship and shore exchange, data exchange, a lot of these things are meant also to get the shore side of work and also support from the office. Of course, with the current situation that we're all in, it makes all of these much more interesting, and it's kind of speed up the uptake and of new technologies and applications.
Hello, my name is Håkon Ellekjær, and I'm heading up the 3D printing venture in Wilhelmsen and part of the Open Innovation team. And in the 3D printing venture, together with our joint venture partner ThyssenKrupp, we are taking and moving away from the traditional and physical supply chain to a digital supply chain for maritime spare parts. In a way, offering on-demand manufacturing close to the point of need. And we're doing this through an ecosystem approach, working closely with our customers. And then if you hear the OEMs, for instance, Wartsila, and technology partners and manufacturing partners. So it's a true example of how stakeholders and partners can come together to create a new offering that is sustainable and much more resilient than the traditional supply chain, where we have seen the quite large effects during the pandemic for sure.
Excellent. Now that we know everyone a little bit better, there are a few key topics that we wanted to cover in this session. Having had a little discussion with everyone here week before last as well. So we want to talk a little bit about what remote operations means to us. It's also kind of not really possible to sit on stage in 2021 and not talk about the impact of COVID on these operations as well. And further to that, also on collaboration and ecosystems. So how do we succeed with these technology developments, not just in remote operations, but also into the general space. And we also, of course, welcome questions from the audience, both virtually and physically present here. You can send it in via the Hop-in app that everyone is registered on and logged into, or you can stand up and someone will run over with a microphone. And please wait with your question until you have a microphone in hand, because that will help the virtual audience also to hear what question you're asking our panelists. I wanted to start with Claus, because Claus was giving us quite a good introduction to things here. And on your little futuristic voyage with Elon, one of the things you said was that one technology enables another. So in the view of remote operations, so which links do you think will come first? Which technologies will be enabling each other first?
I think sort of AI and machine learning is one of the key things because it's only software. So you can means you can use existing hardware like cameras or even electricity things. You don't need to make a lot of changes to existing stuff as long as you can get something from that the AI can understand. And AI, because it's software and it's on this exponential growth path, is really developing the fastest. That eventually might get a boost, I think, from quantum software technology, but that's still a little bit out.
Excellent, thank you. Did you have a comment on that, Tarun?
Yeah, sure. I think that's a good starting point. If I had a crystal ball on what technologies would come first, probably I'll be sitting with Mr. Musk somewhere, right? But the lens that we need to look at the technology landscape is not just think about our own industry. We got to look at some of the other industries where your technology evolution is happening. To Klaus's point, you mentioned that a lot of the innovation and co-creation and creation of tech is not happening in the maritime industry. It is happening in other industries that we can start leveraging on. So when you're talking about AR-enabled training, ultimately AR was not a result of innovation in the maritime industry. We found the use cases. The challenge here is how do you then keep a view on would you want to be the first mover in a technology, right? So quantum computing, do we as a maritime industry start having use cases of quantum computing to solve a problem like port orchestration, or do we wait? Do we let the airline industry go forward first and then we follow through? I think that's the bigger question. I'll give you another example. I think my personal view is augmented decision making using AI ML would be the first area because it helps the incumbents see the dollars and cents from a use case perspective. And eventually you will have most of the incumbents having probably an enhanced risk appetite to try out more futuristic Horizon 2 and Horizon 3 tech coming forward.
I think it's a good point because sometimes adjacent industries like oil and gas, for example, for a number of reasons is in a better position to try things out. They don't have the additional challenges that you have on ships, connectivity and other things. And they also are less fragmented. So you find huge R&D and capabilities within some of the automations.
You have to hold the mic a little bit closer because they can't pick up the sound properly.
Oops. I'm saying in oil and gas you have capabilities sometimes because of size, less fragmentation, so you have large R&D and capabilities that enable things faster than perhaps in maritime. And you don't have the fact that you're on a ship which might not have connectivity.
I'd actually like to jump in there as well.
Please.
I think it's important to recognize exactly what Klaus is saying, actually, because I think we need to look at it from, say, two angles. You mentioned machine learning, which now actually gives us now like a readily available option to have predictive insights. Okay, and with the amount of information that we are receiving, we cannot ignore the fact that one, you have the machine learning, which is low-hanging fruit, but we have to look at the second part, which is the path forward. You mentioned oil and gas having access to like increased connectivity and bandwidth. It's very easy to look at now like the destination and ignore now like the journey. We need to look at making sure that our infrastructure is set up to actually receive the increased amount of bandwidth, the amount of data that's going in there. We cannot only look at trying to build Ferraris if we don't pave the roads. So I think it's important to recognize that. Right?
Dominic?
Yeah, just to take this on further, I mean, if we look at the topic we have in front of us today, the keyword here is remote operations. And if we take this word in this context alone, it means doing the work outside of the place that is happening. Right? And I think I cannot agree more that the connectivity is definitely important because without having the right data that you can see the picture from shore, you wouldn't know what is happening. So you need first back to the original question from Ronny. So which comes first? I think in order to get that picture, to have the understanding of what is happening on the vessel, I think the technology to bring that on, that should come first. I mean, let's put aside all the big buzzwords in town and look at how we, first of all, get the correct image of what is happening before we can even do anything.
And just to add on that, I think connectivity, AI, machine learning are quite present technologies and well proven in other industries, and we'll see increasingly more use of that technology in the maritime space as well. But I think to follow up on that, most of these technologies that we're working on are existing, are proven, such as 3D printing is a proven technology and heavily used for many years. Drones is not something that is new, but what we probably see is that with all these different technologies connecting well together will drive the adoption. And the biggest barrier for us to adopt new technology in the maritime space today is not the technology itself. It's the mindset, it's the processes, and it's the people. And I think when we see, from my point of view, working with F-drones, for instance, on delivery of drones, Claus mentioned that an IoT device could tell if a part needed to be changed. If you can work together with many different technologies, you'll be able to accelerate the use of multiple technologies together. I think from an ecosystem point of view, we should probably touch upon a bit later as well. It's not only working in an ecosystem for that specific venture or for that specific business, but it's also across multiple technology stacks where I see a benefit of working together.
Excellent. There are actually a couple of things that I wanted to follow up on what was discussed just now. One of them is that was touched upon by a couple of the gentlemen here was most of us who are sitting on stage here, actually, I think 5 out of 6 have a background from this industry predominantly, maybe with the exception of Claus. But we also talk about how we need to learn from other industries. You're the only one here who has first-hand experience coming from other industries and into shipping of the ones sitting on stage. How has that been, for better and worse, like pros and cons?
Yeah, I think there's, so in oil and gas you have, I think, more capabilities that can look further into the future and they can afford that. So strategic technology that looks, and has central teams that looks out 5 years and observes on a continuous basis which technology is how mature, how fast is it progressing, and then orchestrate sort of a entry into the use through trials. So that's a big difference, I think. We're one of the bigger companies in this space, I think. And the way to do innovation, I think, in both cases, and that's the commonality, I think. In oil and gas, you had a special team dealing with startups because it's very difficult for sort of traditional corporates to engage with startups because they don't have 3 years of audited financial history and they're not on the procurement list and all this kind of thing. And it's in both directions. So working through some accelerator kind of entity, and I was previously helping with PS71 and PortXL and those kinds of things. I think that's the way to do things for both large sort of corporate industry players as well as for shipping companies. That was one experience.
So that is coming from the point of view of a rather large operator with a rather sizable budget. But of course, one thing that we are all aware of is the majority of operators are actually quite small when it comes to the maritime operations side, or medium size at best. They don't have the funds or capacity to do something like this. How do they get on board? How do they get to take part in the adventure that is really getting into remote operations?
I think that's kind of where the venture industry comes in to finance and to put up funds to allow small startups to develop their solutions and then go get involved with trials. I think the trial itself in some ways doesn't cost that much effort. It's more the willingness, be prepared to try things out. That doesn't necessarily require big budgets. But of course the money to develop these solutions need to come from somewhere. And that's, I think, where venture capitalists, early stage investors, angel networks, individual angels, family offices, I think, really step in to at least provide government grants and all sorts of subsidiary schemes and so forth. I think that at least provides the financial muscle that's needed to drive innovation.
Tarun.
I think that's
I expect you to have a comment on this.
Absolutely. So from our perspective, why is an open innovation approach crucial, right? I would answer it in 2 parts. One is from a generic industry perspective, and then I would sort of zone in from a remote operation and tech perspective. I think the maritime industry is just starting the journey in adoption of future-looking tech. I don't want to say this is the start of our innovation journey. I think there's enough innovation that happens in our own industry, right? So if you look at ship design and what have you. An open innovation approach allows you not just to collaborate with startups, it also allows you to collaborate across the value chain. So you could be collaborating with your competitors, competitive ship owners, you could be collaborating with your customers, you could be collaborating with your suppliers. Now, why is that crucial? It is crucial not just from a cost syndication perspective, it is crucial from a learning curve perspective, right? So the best model to think about is how can you run multiple experiments with a view that you have a portfolio of experiments with propensity. Some of them might be successful, some might be extremely high risk, but at a portfolio level, it's actually making sense for the ecosystem to learn. So we at Rainmaking, instead of having a domicile accelerator, we run a fairly open innovation platform where we are very clear that if you are a competition as well, you're more than welcome to collaborate with us. Now the second thing is, why is that crucial from a remote operation and technology perspective? So that's an era where we're just starting to see developments in spaces like augmented decision making, or OEMs coming into the play that you can have a digital twin on shore, clean up the data that Dominic was mentioning about. I think an open innovation approach for a hairy problem like remote operation makes a lot of sense, because not everybody would have the risk appetite, the financial appetite, or even the bandwidth from a talent perspective in an organization to sit there and run these experiments in isolation. And running a venture is an extremely isolated exercise. It's not fun. It could be years before you see returns, even from a financial perspective. So I think collaboration within a framework is pretty crucial. And being in a place like Singapore, where you have an active regulator, where you can have not just data sandboxes, legal frameworks, legal sandboxes, which actually solves for some of the value chain problems. I think that's really crucial.
Excellent, thank you. I'd like to hear from Jamie and Dominic as well on this. How do you do this in your organizations?
So I completely agree with the open innovation same approach. We at Thome have adopted the same philosophy. We recognize that no single entity possesses all the solutions and resources to tackle all the problems that it's facing at once. And we can all benefit from actually working together, and I think the learning curve approach is a fantastic way to look at it. I think sometimes, like you mentioned, we need to probably look beyond the maritime industry, because a lot of the other industries have solved a lot of the problems that we face in an analogous way. If you look at the internet itself, the power of the internet is allowing us to virtually live stream this. What we don't realize, and what many people don't realize, is that the internet is actually a highly regulated framework. You have the Internet Standards Organization that actively develop architecture, policy, and processes that actually actively govern the internet. It happens in such a seamless way that we as the users don't perceive this, and yet it allows any single one of us to actually actively engage in that sandbox to actually innovate. We can look at Amazon, look at Netflix. The internet is your playground, but there's a standardized framework that everybody gets together and agrees that this is how we plan to use it. And I think an open innovation approach and an open-mindedness to look beyond the maritime industry will only serve to benefit all of us.
Thank you. Dominic.
Yeah, we have seen a lot. We have been looking at projects, customers who often felt seminars like this, technology uptake is all something for the bigger organizations to go into. This is, I get there only if I'm of a certain size, the shipping company of a certain size. But that is not true, because the challenge here is not about the technology itself, it's about the data that you have, what you're working with, the data that you have, right? And we see a big gap in organizations not able to harness the data that they're sitting on, and yet they felt, well, I'm still light years away from doing all of these things. This is something far and beyond. So initiatives such as the playbook from MPA, I think these are all good drivers to kind of bring to level the initial ground, to bring along and to grab the other companies which are far behind, but we should not let that happen. Right? And that mindset of this technology is not my game unless I'm a certain size, that has to be jettisoned. Right? Someone has to drop it.
I think regardless of size of the company, you always have the option to participate. You might not have the risk appetite or funds to run the venture as such. There are a lot of options to participate. And from an open innovation approach, we have deliberately called our division in Wilhelmsen Open Innovation, because that's the methodology that we breathe every day. And with our customers, it's not a customer-supplier relationships in a venture. It's a partnership model. We're actively working together with stakeholders across the different, both from an OEM, supplier, technology point of view. I think this is the only way when working with disruptive technologies that we need to work together. If we're working in isolation, the success will be limited. And we also need to allow for, as we see from our point of view, partnering up with other companies. For instance, doing joint ventures with the Kongsberg Group on autonomous vessels, joint venture with ThyssenKrupp on 3D printing, finding like-minded companies where you are having complementary capabilities and together can make something happen.
I think there's also a structural advantage of maritime companies, because one of the things I noticed that a lot of players are family-owned. And you see sort of the second or third generation, the younger generation coming into the business, and they come with, a passion about sustainability, and the whole thing is you can make very quick decisions compared to a large corporate, and that's a huge advantage that allows, I think, it plays into the idea of open collaboration, of quick and agile methods.
No, I firmly agree with you on that, Claus, and I think that's one thing that we see as well, that some of these family-owned businesses have next generation who are quite actively taking part in driving that company into the future. I mean, your owners with the Ofer family in Gillow being very much involved in the technology ventures of EPS and the collaboration with Techstars, and you see the same thing with Christian Oldendorf and Reederei Nord and his investment, his venture capital investment structure that he set up in Berlin. Who's also then an investor in Nautilus Labs that you are again partnering with, etc. And you see these initiatives in various places where, particularly in our industry, it seems the family-owned businesses are the ones who are really going that extra distance. I think also in part because they have, you have these young generation who's taken over the family business. They want to pass it on to the next generation. They see that they need to do something because the reality they grew up in and the reality of the business they're supposed to run just don't work together. So that's definitely one. There was one thing that I was thinking about when everyone was commenting on the previous question, and that is in terms of like how do you drive innovation and how do you move forward with that. And I realized sitting there thinking that we pretty much only have big organizations on stage with large numbers of staff and big coffers to start projects like this. But I would like to hear from anyone in the audience, both physically or virtually, who run, let's say, smaller or medium-sized operators or maritime companies, how you have experience with this, or how you have engaged with the technology side of things, or your thoughts on this. So whether you want to stand up or say something now, or whether you want to send a question, then we can pick it up later. But I would like to hear from someone beyond just the panel who have more of the experience from the smaller organization rather than the very large ones that most of us here represent. But moving on to, while we wait for anyone to bring any comments, moving on to the other part. And we've talked a lot about how COVID has been a challenge and has brought on lots of challenges, but I'd rather like to turn that around and ask each and every one on stage, how have you actually leveraged COVID to take your organization further and step this up rather than seeing as, going back to the old classic saying of, never waste a good crisis. How have you taken COVID and leveraged that or this crisis to bring the organization forward? Again, with a view to the remote operations and technology side of things. Anyone wants to go first? Otherwise, I'll start with Claus.
Yeah, so I think one of the things we learned, well, I learned first when I came into shipping that shipping is a pretty conservative industry. It's very much kind of office culture. You're in the office from 9 to 6 kind of thing. I want to see you. I don't know if that's because nobody trusts each other. It's just a different culture kind of thing. And through the lockdown, through the circuit breaker here in Singapore, I think luckily we were prepared from the infrastructure as well, Microsoft 365, so we were prepared with more luck than planning perhaps on the technical side. But culture-wise, I think like many people around the world, we learned that actually it worked quite well, and people, enjoyed it. Of course, there are lots of things that needed to be fixed, but I think we sort of laid the seed that we can collaborate remotely. And for a shipping company, of course, that by nature works with ships around the world, with seafarers around the world, with ports everywhere, that I think could unleash potential that we don't even know yet. I think, and we haven't sort of, we haven't just started that yet.
Mm. And how did you leverage this as EPS? How did you...
To be more flexible, for example, flexible work hours, teams that, because we still can't be fully in the office yet, of course. So I think we're starting to explore how we can work more productively, more satisfyingly for employees. We're trying to figure out how to leverage it further. It's just the beginning, but we already have more flexibility for everybody.
Tarun?
I think all of us in most parts of the world sort of pivoted to some sort of a virtual work from home, you're on mute, can you see my screen kind of a setup, right? But more from a technology landscape perspective, one of the key trends that we have been able to sort of have a look and have a pulse on it is the world outside the shipping industry has now started to look at shipping as a key enabler, where even though depending on which report you pick up, shipping was seen as, yes, 80-90% of the trade happens by ships, there was never a discussion on the importance of shipping from the actors outside of shipping. And this opportunity being remote, what has happened is, at least in the venture space and startup space, we've been able to collaborate with potentially other industry participants, right, who are now looking at shipping from a very different lens. So a good example is, Claus, one of your portfolio companies, Nautilus Labs, one of their investors is M12 Ventures. Now, M12 Ventures is nothing but Microsoft. Having these strategic investors coming and backing tech companies in the maritime space is quite interesting, right? So, of course, they were looking for a different financial return, but now they've seen the importance and the role of the maritime industry, and especially now because of the whole crew welfare and crew change issue, the importance of the industry is now being sort of brought to the forefront of the global economy, and I think that's a unique opportunity for us. So while we have gone remote, while we've gone digital at the same time, I think it is an opportunity for us to not drop the ball now, bring in the other industries, bring in the other tech ecosystems, not just from a collaboration perspective, but also learning lessons, right? So airline industry, as we all know, were suffering and bleeding money. I'm sure they're not sitting, right? They're actually looking at how can they restart operations, right? Once the dust sort of starts settling in and they have a bit of bandwidth, can we bring them inside a room and learn some of the lessons? How did they go about thinking about a future business model, right? Both from a startup perspective, incumbents and ventures, right?
Excellent, Tarun.
At Thome, we've had, several experiences. With regards to like the open innovation side of things, we've thrown our hat in the ring. We've actively approached MPA, working on like Rainmaking, ING, Jurong Port. We are trying to actively define problem statements that actually benefit the stakeholders that we partner up with, and try to offer both manpower resources as best we can to try and see how we can solve those problem statements. And it's been a learning experience throughout this entire journey. The exchange of ideas, seeing new ways to solve, the problems has been extremely eye-opening. So that's not like the open innovation side. With regards to, COVID itself, how we've leveraged off that, I think the entire global supply chain was called upon to become more resilient than ever. So we all made investments into that. Few things that we saw as not like a direct result of that was that with the amount of information that we started receiving from the vessels to shore, we saw a richness of information that we had never seen before. We have a greater insight onto what's happening on board the vessel, And by smartly analyzing all of this data, it allows us to actually have a unique insight to allow us to make better decisions. And these are risk-based decisions. And it's really important, and the USCG has actually been a huge proponent, say, for this. Risk-based decisions rooted in data becomes repeatable and defensible. So it's really important because then you can build processes and policies around that. So that's been interesting. Looking at now like the data side as well, we've been trying to reimagine the way we look at risk. With all due respect to James' reason, his Swiss cheese model is very linear. We don't live in like a linear world. I think Claus mentioned that if you look at all of the new technologies that are out there, the increase in the amount of computing power that we have, with the volume of data that we have at this moment in time, the maritime industry is still looking at, say, loss causation models when it comes to safety, and safety still needs to be our priority. So we are lagging behind in the maritime industry. So what we are trying to do is we are looking at various other methods which other industries have been using to tackle safety. You've got stochastic modeling that tries to predict safety and risk factors by looking at various data inputs. And this is where machine learning actually comes into play, where you can actively define algorithms in a mathematical way. So this is really intelligent input. The other way which we have learned and seen actually great benefit from is that with the adoption of live streaming and augmented reality headsets, etc., we are able to engage our crew in a wholly new and unique way. We always try and communicate with our crew actively to always provide support. But by virtue of seeing somebody on the other side of the screen and them seeing us, we've noticed that there's a great interaction, a greater openness, in addition to the fact that we can use this tool for learning and development, competency development as well. So there's great value there. And lastly, by combining those two things, near real-time access to data and improved telecommunication through streaming and support, we can actively collaborate, or we can actively gain real-time access to experts when it comes to remote support. And this actually allows us to better plan ship visits when it comes to service engineer visits, where you can tackle a problem in real time and become really efficient in solving that problem when you do need to send somebody on board. So these are some of our learnings that we've had so far.
Excellent, thank you. Dominic.
Yep. Fortunately, at Wartsila, we didn't have to scramble in the last 6 months or 8 months during the COVID period to start putting together a series of processes and procedures. Our journey began a few years back when we, as a group, went into the smart marine ecosystem, the smart digital strategy. There are already a few areas that have nicely paved ourselves into the current situation. And there are many direct applications, but I see where it serves us well, serve our customers most best is in 5 areas. One is in the area of vessel monitoring. So we have got, of course, the ability to do predictive maintenance, and our guys, we have set up centers around the world, ability to having real-time monitoring of the assets, of the equipment, of the hardware. That is one area. We have seen also a strong uptake into services. Of course, with the COVID, it's impossible to send our engineers around. So we see also an uptick in remote maintenance. Our engineers now are, of course, able to lock into the vessel without physical attendance, do a lot of diagnostic, troubleshooting, etc. So that part is definitely good because it's not possible to put this together in a short period. A third area we see a lot of demand and also interest is in the area of fleet operation centers. We have seen articles, in fact, the weeks here, Thome, EPS, we probably have explored into areas like this where we help our customers to give the decision support from the shore side, right? Looking at data they get from the vessel, looking at their fleet benchmarking, looking at managing by exceptions, basically through alert notifications where they should take actions. And this is additional help to the crew where they are already so burdened with the current situation plus the additional workload. The fourth uptake is we saw a lot of our training that we used to do, the simulation and training, the academy type of training that was in the past delivered on site, but now it is impossible to have our trainers flying around the world to do this training. And with the cloud simulation, for example, we are able to maintain the same level of service delivery, the same level of training to reach out to people not physically near you. I think that was one good area. And lastly, I think on the area of smart voyage and route planning. Of course, this is something that the master has to do from day to day. But again, we harness the technology. We do a lot of cloud-based kind of a planning where it relieves the crew from hours and hours of duty that they typically have to put in, and we try to relieve them as much as possible to keep their attention on other matters. So these are just some examples what has happened in Wartsila. I'm sure there are much more applications that are out there, but we saw true value in these areas.
Thank you. Håkon.
I will take this from a 3D printing point of view. We entered the 3D printing space 4 years ago because we saw the technology was maturing in other industries, aviation, aerospace, automotive, being a proven technology. For instance, Siemens, they're mass producing spare parts for their wind turbines with 3D printers in Sweden already. So this is technology was proven, and we, of course, being in the maritime space for 160 years, we know that spare parts is a pain point, both in terms of obsolescence, lead time, part performance, and we also ask ourselves the question: what if we were able to produce parts on demand, close to the point of need? Would we be able to solve some of these pain points? And a lot of interest in the market when we started, and 3D printing was a new word. And for many, we did pilots, went on board, etc. But then COVID hit, and COVID also proved, in addition, that the today's supply chain, and with regards to spare parts, is not a resilient model, and several original equipment manufacturers having limited capacity, some need to close down production, causing issues for many of the vessels. I think it was the year that everybody learned about 3D printing. I think 3D printing was in the media almost every week in terms of the medical sector, being a fantastic, resilient technology in terms of you don't need to store or freight any parts. It's all about sending digital files and producing on demand. You need to put a digital file into the printer, which is then applicable for the part. If it is a large metal part, up to 5 times 2 times 1 meter, or it's a small complex polymer part. The technology itself is incredibly versatile. I think COVID, from our point of view, increasingly shown the benefits and the opportunities presented by the technology as it is done with other technologies, especially within the remote operations area.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I wanted to ask Tim or Peter if there are any questions from our virtual audience or live audience. Tim? Okay. To make sure that we involve everyone in our little discussion, also those who are not present in this room today.
So a question from the virtual audience is, how do we ensure that we're meeting the cross-border regulatory requirement while innovating on these remote technologies? Would you observe a further accelerating of the adaptation of these remote technologies?
Gentlemen? Could you repeat the question one more time, please?
Yeah, sure. So how do we ensure that we're meeting the cross-border regulatory requirements while innovating on remote technologies? And would you observe a further acceleration of the adaptation of this technology?
Excellent.
Maybe I'll take a stab at this. Right?
Sure.
So the way I understand the question is, how do you, if you are a talent in the creation space, you're an entrepreneur, how do you make sure that the legal risks are mitigated from a trade perspective? I think it's not just about the legal requirements. It's about making sure that you're able to have early validations from your customers, from your users of the tech that you're building, right? So when you're going and at the early stage itself, you'll be making sure that any trade barriers or legal barriers or regulatory barriers are incorporated into your sort of product development. I think that is the biggest challenge. Quite often what we've seen is, especially for early stage startups, if that validation loop is not early on in the process, you may have burnt out your initial seed capital or initial funding, and you would end up with a product which is either not market ready or is facing regulatory challenges. So the crucial part is, how do you make sure that early on you go out in the market, you're engaging with your value chain, you're engaging with the right stakeholders, basically as a means to de-risk it.
Right. My initial thought when I heard the question was also like, when you look at a lot of these things that we're testing and trying out, some of these are tried, particularly look at drones, for example, or other things. They're tested domestically. Operating cross borders, operating internationally is very often a challenge, because shipping is, by any definition, the most global industry in the world. And everything that we are going to use needs to work in a number of jurisdictions across a number of different national and global legislations and so forth. My take on the question was along the lines of, how do we get past that? And I think all of you have experiences with operating across a number of different jurisdictions, and also probably testing things in more of a cross-border setting versus, say, testing drones in Singapore, which is purely a domestic agreement with the aviation authority and the MPA in this city.
There's one aspect, I think, that in Singapore that I think Kenneth might have mentioned, which is the collaboration between different port authorities. And I think that helps us, for example, for some of our inspection sort of underwater robots. We can test them in Singapore, we can have a dialogue with somebody in Rotterdam also. I think that helps to address some of the key areas for those types of valid problems, challenges you have.
Ronny, if I may just also
please.
provide
please.
this part. I mean, to the question, I think it's a good question that it has to be trial here and adopted here, but it has, as you mentioned, is international, so different ports also need to support these initiatives, which is why I think the port authorities are not alone. We actually do have port authority roundtable that we actually try to form port authorities together, share data, share experiences. So for instance, autonomous vessel, we know we can't do just alone. So we come and form the port alliances, authorities, to look at what are the test cases each port need to agree on. And then if we can have a common set of test cases, so when you try it here, and then when you go to another port, you have the same set of test cases, it will help to increase the adoption. So if there is a need for remote operation test cases and all that, we'll be more than happy to kind of support and lobby the rest of the port authority to also have the same understanding, same test cases and the support, and we start to share the knowledge elsewhere. Likewise for future fuel and all this, which is all about getting collaboration with different port authorities. Hope that answers some of the questions.
Thank you, Kenneth. I think we have another question in the front here from Paul Kostman from Innovation Norway and Team Norway here in Singapore.
Hi.
Could we get the microphone here?
Yeah. Can
we get a microphone to the front, please?
I actually just wanted to add to that what Kenneth was saying, that there are joint projects under development and also in action already between various countries and ports in Europe and in Singapore, where you test autonomous technologies, and also you look at decarbonization, various kinds of facets, where the learning will actually be disseminated amongst the ports and authorities and so on. For instance, a joint EU program which is being developed with this in mind. So there are projects under development that are looking at this in various countries.
Excellent. There are more questions here, but I also wanted to, please. Peter.
Thank you. just, it is my view that we're on the cusp of something quite interesting in the maritime space, and that is that we are an industry where the regulations have triggered innovation, and we're on the cusp now where the innovation is probably going to trigger regulation. And we see that in more and more jurisdictions, and we see that in the more proactive port authorities as well. So my question really for the members of the panel is, what responsibility do you think as innovators we have in order to assist and help actually that move where regulators are comfortable that innovation can move forward? And what kind of arrangement do you think needs to take place for us to really cross that threshold? It's a pretty massive tipping point. I'm curious if there's any views.
I'll try and take a stab at this one. I think it's important that we recognize that whatever technology that we have, be it remote in this case, or any other innovative solutions in the future that do eventually come about, that from a maritime perspective, the overall processes that we have will still remain largely the same. We're still moving, say, a cargo from one point to another with a variety of players in between and at the endpoints. The technology that we adopt and we actually develop needs to continue to provide the same, if not better, level of assurance to all of the stakeholders that we have. And we need to be able to clearly define those problem statements when we actually develop these solutions, but also ensure that we do not lose sight of these assurance factors, because that's where regulators come from. If we look at Pier 71 as a fantastic example, or some of the classification societies that are involved in, say, underwater remote technologies under like the IAX framework, at the end of the day, the standards for assurance remain largely the same. And when you adopt the new technologies, we are only serving to prove a level of equivalence from an assurance perspective. So it's very important that as innovators, as players within the industry, driving innovation or being a part of it, that we are able to ensure that our stakeholders, our clients, our customers, our fellow players demonstrate to regulators that the level of quality and integrity in whatever we do is maintained, if not improved, by adopting these technologies. And if they see that, then we can actively work with them to actually define policy and regulation around that.
Anyone else on the panel want to comment on this as well?
To that, I think shipping, oil and gas and similar are potentially hazardous environments with risks that you don't find if somebody is testing a consumer banking site. You can't do easy A/B testing kind of thing. So I think a lot of the robotics relying or introducing technology, innovating and then relying on that, it has to be done in a very careful way because there are risks involved and they need to be mitigated. One of the ways that might address it is to work very closely with class societies, because they kind of have an independent view. They're used to do this kind of thing in addition to their own people. So at BP we've done some project where we work with robotics or tank inspection. We work very closely with one of the class societies, and that was one way I think to address the otherwise potential concern.
Excellent. Anyone else from the panel? If not, we have one question here first. The gentleman on the inmost sat table. And then Punit afterwards.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I can see Claus has actually made a very good presentation to lead the audience to see the future of 2030 about the maritime. And also we have Kenneth from MPA about this playbook to actually guide all those users. And also one of the past virtual forums that Nicole had actually mentioned that a lot of people actually, you should actually put a stop and have a look at what are the markets that we have for the technologies and innovation. So the question here is, what is the benchmark or what is the checkpoint that all these innovation or different technologies are actually putting the maritime industry to lead into the shipping 4.0? So how do you think about the current status of the overall maritime? And a lot of observers are actually observing what are the test use cases and what are the good examples that can lead the people to make the first steps. So how do you think about this? Thank you.
Well, if I may, I would think, Tarun mentioned earlier, I think, to look at other industries. So one way to think about benchmarks would be not to look outside the maritime industry, and maybe picking industries that are particularly good at a particular thing that is relevant for us. So it could be, you know, I don't know, the airplane turnaround in aviation. It could be, you know, the industrial use of digital twins as a matter of, you know, of routine in oil and gas, where, you know, and you pick some of those examples and think that's the best sort of in class across different industry, and we aim to beat that or use it as a benchmark would be one thought.
Anyone else?
And just to follow up on that as well, in terms of looking at other industries, in the Open Innovation team in Wilhelmsen, we also ask ourselves 3 questions when you look into new potential ventures. And the first one is there a need? Is there an actual demand for this technology or for this service in the market? If the question, or if the answer is no, then you just stop straight away. But if it's yes, then you continue to the next one. Can we do it? Do we have the capabilities? Do we have the technology? Do we have the connectivity on board the vessel to actually be able to deliver this service? And then the third one, which is also quite important, is it worth it? Is it commercially viable? Is it interesting to look at from a business point of view as well? If you're able to tick these 3 boxes, then it's worth looking into. And from our point of view, we have different requirements for the different stages. Or the different maturity stages where the venture is at. So if it's very early stage, the requirements are less, allowing us to continuously explore, even though, for instance, the is it worth it question isn't 100% clear yet, but it will become clear.
Yeah, in a lot of the projects that we do, we often advise, look at the 80-20 rule. I mean, there are so many problems that you want to solve in the organization. If you put all of them together, if you put all the departments together into one technology debate, you get nowhere. So go for the biggest problem that costs you the least. I mean, cost meaning not only financial, but in terms of resources as well. Start with that, build on it, and then you get the momentum. Because if you start planning a big project and everybody get washed out very quickly. So that perhaps is the answer also related to your question.
And then we had another question from Punit.
So this was very interesting. As I said, I think some of the examples that Claus mentioned are absolutely fascinating to see. My comment or my point is really about trying to use a lot of these innovative tools in shore-based services as well. When I talk about shore-based, I mean commercial chartering aspects. Because one of the biggest challenges is that we don't have any mandatory qualifications to start off in a commercial shipping as against if you need to go on board, you obviously need to be trained for it. The other thing is that I also believe that when you talk about remote operations, with COVID, obviously everything is remote now. So including the people, the level of expertise, knowledge, knowledge sharing, a lot of that can be done technologically kind of standardized as well going forward. Have you, Claus, in EPS, seen anything like that happen in terms of using some of these video-based trainings to use in the chartering side as well? And maybe even in Thome, how that actually has happened. That could be interesting to see some sharing on that one, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I think we've sort of seen the use of collaboration tools across the board, including onshore very much. And I think COVID offered us the opportunity for everybody who even did not, some people might not have used, you know, Teams or something before. All of a sudden everybody had to, and people discovered how they could use it and how they could use it more creatively, how they could reach their manager actually faster and come up with sort of different uses, ice-breaking sessions and those kinds of things. And I think there's future in that. I mean, even if you look at the virtual reality environment, maybe we can use something like that instead of Zoom in the future, where we walk into a space like this and it's filled with people and we hear the spatial sound. So, you know, virtual reality might be a future collaboration environment that could be very, very strong. Couple that with digital twin.
I have a something more of similar question like Puneet. With the digital technology like Wartsila doing remote login on the equipment and Claus doing remote operations, what does the panel think? Will the technical third-party ship management model become less relevant or become obsolete over a period of years? Any views?
Can I repeat your question? You said with the coming on
With
technologies,
let's say OEMs taking more active part in monitoring the equipment, and the class getting involved in the remote inspections. There will be a lot of collaboration between the two. Will that reduce the third-party manager's role in technical management?
this is complementary, right? I mean, you need until the day that we have complete autonomous shipping, where there's no crew on board, where everything can be done remote. I think it's still a phased in. And at this moment, at least for Wartsila, what we are doing is we are looking at taking the value of this data and relieving the workload from the shore guys to put in reports or to spend hours behind to look at a problem by leveraging on the technology to produce, to use the data for useful information for him to carry out his day-to-day. It is not about cutting away that middle block and say we jump from here to complete autonomy. So not so much yet in my lifetime I see this, but I don't know about my fellow panel members.
As now like a third-party ship manager, I would hope certainly not. No, I think I tend to agree. I think it's complementary. I believe that there's like various moving parts to third-party ship management, and we always say that we want to operate in a safely and reliably. Our people are at the forefront. It's uncompromising safety, and at the same time we want to make sure our stakeholders have reliability. And it's only working with partners like, say, Wartsila by able to get all of the data points that you meant. And that's like a fantastic point you make. By having access to those data insights will allow people to make decisions quicker, and it complements that entire process of actually operating a vessel. So if you look at our inspection side, for example, we would only be able to have very targeted, risk-based inspections or our audit-based our remote audits. They would not work as effectively as they do or become an iterative process if we didn't actually rely and collaborate with players such as Wartsila. So I think in the long run, and I think you put it correctly, at least not in my lifetime, I hope, I don't see it happening though.
I think it also probably requires a different skill set. It's probably one thing today to pick up a phone for somebody on shore to talk to a captain, listen to the problem, and based on experience giving advice, versus somebody who looks at sophisticated data-rich tools like an Nautilus, which requires very tech-savvy skills. You probably need to understand statistics. So it's a very different style, I think, and that might attract different skills and different people in the future.
If I can quickly add to that comment, right?
I'll give you 15 seconds. 15
seconds it is, right? So whether it's a commercial shipping or third-party ship management, I think it's more of a business model innovation side of things. So fundamentally, I do agree that third-party ship management would exist in some shape or form. However, the nature of that would evolve drastically. To Klaus's point, you might have a very different kind of individuals and talent running ship management firms, where it could be data scientists on one hand because of the level of connectivity that might happen from ship to shore. I think in any segment of the industry where the entry barriers are quite low and it's more business model innovation, you are also at the risk of getting disrupted from external parties, right? So whether if you look at freight forwarding as a segment, you have freight orchestration marketplaces quickly evolving. So I think that's a trend that we also need to keep a pulse on.
Excellent. I think Peter's telling me we have to finish now, and taking into consideration that we have other speakers lined up as well. And I think to the points that were made, I've made this similar point before as well, that I don't think the intermediaries will disappear, but they will change very much in the way they do business, and I firmly believe that those who succeed at leveraging technology to their advantage will be the ones who will succeed in the future, as is the case with pretty much any other business or industry. To summarize really quickly a couple of the points, it was said we should leverage our visibility now post-COVID as an industry to really collaborate with other industries and learn from them. I think it was a point made by several of the panelists also that no company is too small to partner with and be involved in trying technology and learning from things done in other industries, and to pick solutions relevant to our industry from the relevant industries to compare ourselves with, so that we have collaborations that make sense, and also to work with class societies because they have experience with working with regulators and tackling the regulatory challenging aspect of some of these technologies that we are looking to put into use. And instead of me having the last 3 words, Håkon, what are those 3 questions again?
Is there a need? Can we do it? And is it worth it?
Exactly. Is there a need? Can we do it? Or is it worth it? Ask yourself those 3 questions every time you look to try and solve a problem or build a solution. Thank you very much. Yes,
maybe
Peter.
we can borrow, because there's some very interesting questions. It's a very special panel. We don't get it together in that shape and form so quickly anymore. So we
you
have
to shout louder.
We have the round tables after this. So probably we can eat into this for 3-4 minutes.
Excellent. Fire away.
Can I please ask 2 questions? First from Rob O'Dwyer. We all know him. Do you think technology development changed the age profile of the global fleet? Perhaps ships that can't retrofit new systems will be prevented from operating by regulations that require a certain data reporting infrastructure or remote access capabilities. How would this impact shipping and the global economy?
Who wants to go first?
I knew you would love that one.
We have also looked at, of course, the bridge side of things or the engine room side of things, right? I mean, there are technologies out there to aggregate the data. It doesn't mean that you have to go for a complete retrofit to get the data points that you need. There are facilitating technologies, hardware, to allow to transmit the data points across. I think that's one thing to be explored. It doesn't mean that I can only get a deep censored vessel retrofitted before fulfilling the requirements. If we look at what requirements we're talking about, the IMO DCS requirements, or the upcoming emission requirements, or the cybersecurity requirements, which area? I mean, there is no authority that will put a big umbrella regulation that only can be fulfilled if you are up to certain years, having certain age of vessel. I think that's not the case that we see today. Right? There is still a lowest denominator possible you could go for.
Thank you. I would like to close with one of the questions that Giampiero from IB sent in. Interesting one on cost. He says, the shipping addressable market is, by IT terms, microscopical. 34,000 ships at the most could eventually make use of advanced technology. The owners of these ships consider any cost above $50 as too expensive. I guess that's per month. So promoting new technology, which is expensive to build, becomes very difficult. How do you bypass these problems?
Not sure how to bypass the problem, but I think there are certain types of technologies, take AI, robotics, and other things that are applicable to other industries as well. And that's basically one way. Sometimes they come from other industries, like even video analytics that we showed earlier is an example. And that, I think, is one way sort of to spread the cost if it's something that goes way beyond shipping.
Maybe I can answer that in a slightly different way as well. I think we need to slowly start moving away from seeing a solution as like something off in the distance as a product. I think Punit mentioned skill sets, like we mentioned talent. One of the things, say specifically in a data scientist, one of the things that we've looked to is said, okay, we are trying to deliver value to our clients. Instead of trying to sell a new technology, how can we look at our people development in a new way such that our solutions are embedded within the company? So by delivering standardized ship management, you are getting a different, say, an innovative way of ship management. And one specific example of that is that COVID allowed us to take a risk into looking at diversifying our skill sets internally. And one specific thing was us actually utilizing SG United. We looked to universities to actually look for data scientists because we don't have this competence internally. And we have benefited tremendously from this. It was part of our headcount. We learned from them. We now actually have developed solutions that we can deliver to our clients at no cost to them, actually. And this is something that we need to look at. We need to have this openness to our skill sets and trying to look at delivering value from a different viewpoint.
Thank you, Jamie. And with that, let me thank Ronny for great guidance. Thank you, and the esteemed panel for fantastic contributions.